NASA didn't break the sound barrier without the boom. Not yet, anyway. Here's what actually happened on June 5, 2026. The X-59, NASA's radical, needle-nosed research jet, went supersonic for the first time. Mainstream media ran with it. Son of Concorde goes supersonic without the boom. The headlines wrote themselves. But what most of that coverage glossed over was something NASA had already stated clearly in its own pre-flight documentation, published days before the flight. The X-59 would be accompanied by an F-15 chase plane, a conventional supersonic jet whose booms were loud enough to drown out any sound the X-59 actually made. Which means the central claim embedded in those headlines, that NASA demonstrated quiet supersonic flight, is, as of this recording, still unproven in public record. The supersonic flight itself happened. That part is real. But the without the boom part, that still needs to be measured. Now, to be clear, this isn't a scandal. NASA never claimed June 5th was the acoustic proof. That's coming in a later phase of testing. But the gap between what the headlines implied and what the data actually shows is exactly the kind of gap worth understanding. Because what's at stake here isn't just one aircraft. It's a long-standing federal ban on overland supersonic flight. It's the future of commercial supersonic travel. And it all depends on whether NASA can prove, with rigorous data, that a plane flying faster than sound can be quiet enough for the people on the ground to tolerate. That's the question this video is going to answer. A sonic boom isn't just loud, it's physical. It's a pressure wave that arrives without warning, rattles structures, and startles communities across an entire flight path. That's the core reason why, for decades, the FAA has maintained a blanket prohibition on routine civil supersonic flight over land without special authorization. Concorde, which could produce booms estimated at over 100 perceived loudness decibels, proved that people would pay for speed on certain routes. But the overland noise problem was never solved, which is why supersonic commercial travel remained confined to oceanic corridors. Here's what matters for our story. The FAA's current rule prohibits the speed itself. It doesn't set a noise threshold that aircraft have to stay under. There's no decibel level you can hit and be cleared for overland flight. Which means if you could engineer an aircraft that produces something so mild it barely registers, the legal question shifts entirely. It stops being, is this plane supersonic, and becomes, is this plane's noise acceptable? That's a question science can actually answer. The X-59 is NASA's attempt to force that question into a regulatory conversation. The aircraft is built around a set of aerodynamic design choices, a long nose that weakens and spreads the front shock, a top-mounted engine, and careful distribution of lift along the fuselage, all working together to help keep the shock waves from merging into that classic double crack. Instead, they reach the ground as a low, diffuse pressure rise, what NASA calls a thump. The target is around 75 perceived loudness decibels. To put that in terms, you can picture NASA-affiliated community testing research has translated the target sound into everyday references, something closer to a car door slam across the street. Not silence, but tolerable. And tolerable might be enough to rewrite the law. Let's talk about the actual aircraft, because it's stranger than the renders suggest. The X-59 has no forward-facing cockpit window in the conventional sense. The pilot looks at a screen fed by external cameras, a system called the E-External Vision System that NASA had to develop and test separately through its own dedicated program. And according to the lead X-59 pilot, Nils Larsen, the aircraft is not naturally benign. His exact words, if this airplane had the computers die on it, it wouldn't be able to fly. That's not a warning label, that's a description of the machine. Without its flight computers, the X-59 cannot fly. Then there's a detail that got less attention in the public coverage. The X-59, the aircraft being positioned as a symbol of next-generation aviation, was built reusing hardware drawn from 4 Cold War-era military jets, the F-16, T-38, U-2, and F-117. NASA's reasoning was practical. Reusing parts from known platforms saves time and money on a one-off research plane. Fair enough, but there's a certain irony in the fact that the argument for the future of commercial flight is being made by an aircraft wearing the bones of the past. The contract to build it was awarded to Lockheed Martin's Skunk Works in March 2018, worth approximately $247 million. And when NASA ran that competition on a full and open basis, expecting multiple aerospace firms to bid, exactly one company submitted a proposal, just Lockheed. The field was thinner than NASA expected, and what came next, years of cost growth, schedule slips, and audit findings, made clear the project carried more friction than the public story suggested. Now let's talk about the money, because this is where the story gets uncomfortable. When NASA awarded the contract to Lockheed Martin in 2018, the agreed price was $247 million. By 2020, Lockheed's own internal cost estimate had already climbed to $284 million. The Government Accountability Office put the total program lifecycle cost at $582 million that same year, with first flight projected for January 2022. Neither the cost estimate nor the schedule held. In December 2021, NASA formally rebaselined the program. Lifecycle cost raised to $697 million. First flight pushed to December 2022. Then, in January 2024, another rebaseline, an additional $101.8 million, schedule slipped by nearly a year and a half. Then, in July 2025, the GAO reported yet another cost increase of $59.7 million, attributed to contractor performance and technical challenges. The actual first flight happened on October 28, 2025, almost 4 years behind the original schedule. What was driving the cost growth? The NASA Inspector General's 2020 audit got specific. Lockheed was behind schedule, struggling to hire qualified engineers, dealing with parts that failed quality checks, and experiencing supplier delays. But the detail that stands out most is this. NASA discovered that Lockheed's Palmdale facility did not have a DCMA-certified Earned Value Management System, the standard tool used to track cost and schedule on government contracts, despite NASA having assumed it did. That meant NASA had to spend substantial effort to validate the reliability of Lockheed's cost and schedule reporting, an exercise the Inspector General estimated would cost an additional $130,000 in oversight work. To be fair, the auditors themselves noted that some of this friction is structurally normal for an unusually ambitious first-of-its-kind demonstrator. One-of-a-kind government research aircraft absorb the kind of uncertainty that private players can't easily price. But the gap between the public-facing narrative, a coming technological breakthrough, and what the oversight record actually showed is significant enough to be part of the story. It's a pattern that tends to emerge when technically ambitious programs run on optimistic scheduling and when there's only one contractor in the room. So let's be precise about what June 2026 actually proved. On June 5th, the X-59 went supersonic for the first time, Mach 1.1, at 43,400 feet, 81 minutes in the air. 1 week later, it hit Mach 1.4 at 55,000 feet, the exact speed and altitude the aircraft was designed to operate at during community overflights. Those are real milestones. The aircraft reached its design conditions. NASA confirmed it has entered the supersonic portion of its flight envelope. That part of the story is genuine. But here's what the headlines didn't say. Neither flight produced a clean, isolated acoustic measurement of the X-59's own sound signature. NASA had already acknowledged this directly in its own pre-flight documentation, published on May 28th. The X-59 would be accompanied by a traditional, supersonic chase aircraft, whose conventional booms would obscure the X-59's quieter thump during this phase of testing. So the central question, does the X-59 actually produce a quiet thump instead of a boom, remains, as of this recording, scientifically unanswered in public record. This isn't a failure of the program, it reflects the structured logic of how this particular program is sequenced. What happened in June was Phase 1, confirming the aircraft can reach its design conditions. What comes next is Phase 2, deploying a network of automated ground sensors across a desert test range, flying without chase plane interference, capturing the X-59's acoustic signature in isolation. NASA's acoustic team has described that campaign as lasting up to 9 months, delivering up to 6 low boom passes per day to the test community. Then comes Phase 3, Community overflights, structured surveys, real residents in real neighborhoods recording their reactions. That data package is what gets delivered to the FAA and ICAO. That's the regulatory product. And as of June 30th, 2026, NASA has confirmed that months of additional performance testing still remain before community overflights begin. Here's the one thing that has changed in the program's favor: the political environment. In June 2025, the White House directed the FAA to start working toward repealing categorical barriers to supersonic flight and developing interim noise-based certification standards, which means when NASA's data finally arrives, it may land on a desk that's already been told to be receptive. The question is whether the data, when it's actually collected, will be strong enough to carry the argument. Here's the question I want to leave you with. Imagine you live under the flight path. 6 times a day, a jet flies supersonic directly over your neighborhood. You don't hear a boom. You hear something closer to a car door closing across the street. A low, brief pressure thump, gone in a second. Would you accept that as the new normal, if it meant that a flight from New York to London took 3.5 hours instead of 7? That's not a hypothetical. That's the actual decision NASA is trying to force into a regulatory conversation. The X-59 doesn't exist to set a speed record. It exists to collect the scientific evidence needed to answer that question at a policy level, to find out where, exactly, the line is between noise that communities tolerate and noise that they don't. And that answer, if it comes, gets handed to the FAA and ICAO, who then decide whether to rewrite rules that haven't changed since 1973. There's one more wrinkle worth noting. Noise may not be the only obstacle. ICAO's own scientific advisory panel has flagged that future supersonic aircraft are likely to have disproportionate climate impacts compared to subsonic flight, even at lower boom levels. So the regulatory finish line may involve more than a single instrument reading. But the core tension of this story is simpler than any of that. NASA may have spent $700 million+ building the world's most sophisticated argument for bringing back overland supersonic travel. The aircraft flies, the design works, and the data that actually matters still hasn't been collected. Whether the argument lands with regulators and with the people living under the flight path is a chapter that hasn't been written yet. So, 6 thumps a day, New York to London in 3.5 hours. Is that a trade you'd make? Let me know in the comments.